So now we need to get into queer theory. This lady was a philosopher, I suppose, writer. She was a Marxist as well, Simone de Beauvoir. And she has been credited as being one of the kind of foundation stones of queer theory, and introducing this notion between sex and gender. So her book in 1949, The Second Sex, this is where this comes out. This is the genesis, I guess, of the fact that, saying that man and woman are socially constructed, right? The notion of man and woman. It's one of her classic statements that often quoted is that one is not born, but becomes a woman. And so she says, being female did not make one a woman. So the reference is there if you want to read this book. This is kind of a genesis of queer theory coming through here. I would describe this man as probably the grandfather of queer theory, Michel Foucault. He's a postmodernist, an activist, and very much into the whole area of sexuality, and opening up sexuality and identity, and exploring the power structures around sexuality. He's a postmodernist, so he doesn't believe in the truth. He doesn't believe in objective truth. He believes that truth is determined by power. So whoever is in power determines what the truth is. So unfortunately, this is a postmodernist construct, this notion of the truth, relative truth, my truth, your truth, that there is no objective truth. And hence, there's a rejection of science and biology and mathematics and any of the hard sciences, anything that is based actually on factual material. This is a huge problem. And I think it's a common problem across all the people that are the founding fathers of queer theory. He challenged the whole essentialist view of sexuality. So again, you can see that, and that's been picked up by queer theory. He was very much into diverse sexual practices, BDSM, for example. He would have been an advocate for. He was an advocate for reducing the age of consent for sex with minors. And there was a kind of a postmodernist movement around that. He is cited heavily in queer theory circles. So people really do love Michel Foucault. I mean, he's revered. These people are all into this power dynamic. They're all into the oppressor-oppressed power dynamic, which obviously feeds into Marxism. That's always a theme with them. Coming closer to the current day, we've got Judith Butler and her 1990 book, Gender Trouble, Feminism, Subversion of Identity. So Judith Butler is very much around the whole notion of gender being performative. If you perform your gender, it's nothing to do with your biology. It's how you perform. And in this way, she was obviously, destabilizing the notion of gender and sex as we would traditionally look on it. And that, there's no natural sex. So again, she would be denying biology. She would be basically saying, the fact that you're male or female from a sexual biological perspective means nothing. Your gender is different to that. She talks about drag performance as a form of subversion. The man in a dress, the woman with the beard kind of constructs, gender bending, the term people would have used years ago. So Gayle Rubin comes at it from a slightly different perspective. She kind of follows along the kind of sexual practice aspects of Michel Foucault, I suppose, the whole, and she has this Thinking Sex Notes for a Radical Theory of Sex and Politics. So these are quotations from that document or from that paper. She talks about boy lovers. So what's a boy lover? So a boy lover is usually a man who wants to have sex with boys.
This is sort of normalizing pedophilia, really. They wouldn't call it pedophilia, but they believe it's sex with children.
Yeah, she's kind of saying, what's the problem? She's kind of saying, what's the problem with child porn? Denouncing erotic injustice. So people who are scorning certain sexual practices, she has an issue with that. It's basically, she wants this whole notion of destigmatization, normalization of sexual practices, which today we would not think as normal. So she created this thing called she has this thing called the charmed circle, and it's got an inner circle and an outer circle. The inner circle there is the kind of normative circle, if I call it that. It's, sex within a gender binary, people married, monogamous sex, etc. The outer circle is sex with multiple people, sex with objects in different places, etc., etc. Okay, it's basically it's queering, basically. It's kind of queering sexuality, and you know, she would be basically saying that right now these other sexual practices were being repressed, sexually repressed. People are looking down on these things. They're condemning these other sexual practices. That's bad. We need to fight against that. We need to say that all of these things are fine and good, and we should be supporting them. This is being brought into the classroom as part of queer theory, as part of SPHE. That's the problem.
A lot of the things on the outer limit circle were the same fetishes we were finding in books at the library in the age 12 section. So that's very interesting that all of this outer limit was already being pushed in the libraries and dismissed by the Garda, the Children's Ombudsman, Children's Books Ireland, Libraries Ireland, county councils, and more. That outer limit was being allowed in front of children in our public libraries, and everybody turned a blind eye, except the concerned parents, of course.
David Halpern is basically celebrating Michel Foucault here. He's calling him Saint Foucault. So, and this is a direct quote from the book. So this is very important because this is a kind of a definition of queer. And if I just talk about the first part of it here, he is distinguishing between gay. So this is separate to a gay identity. So he says a queer identity need not be grounded in any positive truth or in any stable reality. As the very word implies, queer does not name some natural kind or refer to some determinate object. It acquires its meaning from its oppositional position to the norm. Queer is by definition whatever is at odds with the normal, the legitimate, the dominant. It's an identity without an essence. That's it. That line there, the red piece, that's the definition of queer. If you want to take one takeaway from this whole presentation, it's in opposition to the norm. It wishes to subvert the norm and replace the norm. So queer anthropology, let's move on. So I think a lot of people would have seen the genderbread person. This is the gender unicorn, which is commonly used in lectures on queer theory. And you can see this separates out your gender identity, your gender expression, your sex assigned at birth, and then who you're attracted to, who you're emotionally attracted to. So your innate gender identity is independent of your biological sex. It's not binary, it's a spectrum, similarly for your gender expression. And that gender is performative. You know, that's kind of, it's not based on your what you were born as. And it can also be fluid, could change over time. So your body is merely a vessel. The sex has no bearing on your gender identity. And of course, that means then that if there's a mismatch with your gender identity and your body, then you're trans, you've been born in the wrong body, and you're trans, as we know. So this, I think most people would be familiar with this construct now at this point in time. So this is the ideological construct of gender. So if you have this belief system, you take a very different view to the transitioning of a child and how you actually deal with that. You would be very much on the affirmative care model. You'll be socially transitioning them right away. You'll be giving them the new name and pronouns, and you'll be following that medicalized pathway without question. So this is where that comes from. So I think if you understand this, then you'll understand where that mindset comes from. So let's move on. So heteronormativity, the term started evolving at the same time as queer theory, naturally, because queer theory is in opposition to heteronormativity. So people would find, you know, heteronormative constructs as being oppressive. They're oppressing people who are queer, who are not heteronormative. And you'll also hear the term cis heteronormativity, as in cisgender heteronormativity. So, you know, this heteronormative is in alignment with nature. It's in alignment with biology as we understand it. It's in alignment with what people would see as normal. And queer theory is fundamentally in opposition to this, and wishes to break it down. And this whole notion of straight privilege, we've heard of white privilege, so the notion of straight privilege or heteronormative privilege as an oppressive force that's being supported by societal norms that are oppressive to people who aren't heteronormative. There are queer parents. There are queer parents who are married with children. but they have a queer mindset. They follow a queer politics. Childhood innocence is kind of seen as a form of oppression. It's seen as a threat. You have to queer that because childhood innocence is the opposite to queer. That's pretty horrendous now to think about that. So what does that mean in the context of a school if you've a queer teacher? So I asked ChatGPT to give me the objectives of queer theory, and it gave me 10 objectives. So I'm going to go through them here. There's nothing surprising here. Deconstruction of norms, power dynamics. This is what Michel Foucault was looking into in terms of power dynamics associated specifically with sexuality. Fluidity, we talked about gender fluidity, and again, the diversity of people's identity. Intersectionality, where you bring in other aspects of race, etc. Critique of heteronormativity. Okay, so you can see it here. Is to resist heteronormativity, seeks to challenge the privilege of heteronormative ideas in societal structures, right? So there we got it. And the promotion of inclusivity. So this whole world of inclusivity, we see this everywhere today, and we see it hugely in education. And inclusivity is the term used to bring queer theory into the classroom. So for any parent, when you hear inclusivity in your school, when you hear a program talking about inclusivity, that actually means bringing in queer. No one will talk about queer theory. They won't mention queer theory. But what that will mean is the children will be taught about non-binary, about gender ideology, about transitioning, about not using heteronormative language, about using gender-neutral language. That's what inclusivity means in education. So affirmation of non-normative identities, disruption of normative discourses, broaden the understanding of what is considered to be normal. So normalizing the abnormal, normalizing the perverse, etc. Encouragement of activism. This is hugely important. So Bambi Thug is an artist, but she's also a queer activist. She's using her position as an artist to be an activist. And queer theory calls you to activism. You have to be an ally. You have to be an activist for queer. And that's so in indoctrinating children in school into queer theory, even if they're not using the term queer theory, they are ultimately going to indoctrinate those children into activism. And very often that can be Marxist activism. Queers for Palestine, BLM, you mentioned it.
So they're trans right activists, but would they fall under the queer theory, or is that a different activism?
Yes. No, it's the same.
Okay.
It's the same. They're bringing queer into schools under the notion of inclusion, under the notion of anti-bullying.
Mm-hmm.
These are typically the ways. So basically, to get rid of bullying out of a school, you have to indoctrinate the children in the school in queer theory. That's essentially what's happening right now. And they want to bring in, obviously, they want to get children to identify with queer identities, such as being trans, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And they also want to create allies within the school.
Yes.
So if they can't get a child to identify with a queer identity, they want all their friends in the class to be allies for them.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, they can pretty well capture an entire class, basically. It can capture an entire school.
And from stats we've seen, Eugene, I know that I think an article came out a year ago that said up to 90% of children who fell down the transgender path in schools were children on the autistic spectrum. So they potentially could be getting the children that are autistic, or maybe kids who are vulnerable or gay, into this indoctrination, and then they create the rest of the class to be their allies, to stand up and stand with them and be inclusive. Yeah. And if you're not inclusive and not standing as their allies, then you're not kind, or you're a bully, or whatever label they like to put on. So okay, that's their strategy. That makes sense.
It is, yeah. It is very, and so they know then they've locked in that school. Mm-hmm. So exploration of desire and pleasure. Again, we saw this from Gayle Rubin and from Michel Foucault, challenging the moral and cultural norms surrounding sexuality. So, and again, this has been brought into classrooms in secondary school at the moment. Engagement with cultural production. So Bambi Thug, she's engaged with cultural production. She's an artist, a singer. She's going to be representing Ireland at the Eurovision Song Contest. We've seen it with Disney, for example. So Disney have been introducing queer constructs, queer characters into cartoons, into movies, etc. They've been basically queering the cultural production of their movie making, their TV making, etc. So we see that as an example of that. So to queer, it's defined as a verb, and I've got the kind of definitions coming from some of the dictionaries here. So to consider something interpreted from a perspective that rejects traditional categories of gender and sexuality, or in a more general sense, it could be what is considered normal, right? So you can apply that as well. To make or modify something in a way that reflects one's rejection of gender and sexuality norms, and then to change something so that it does not relate to the gender binary, no longer fits traditional ideas of sex and gender. So in the context of a school, the something here would be a child. And we kind of see an example of it there on the left. Changing their mind through indoctrination, and changing their body through transitioning, or both. So this book here, this paper, Queer Pedagogy, Praxis Makes I Am / Perfect, Canadian Journal of Education. So Canada, as we know, is quite a woke society. So here they start talking about actively queering pedagogy. And that means queering the schools, queering the curriculum in the schools. This seems a promising approach indeed for refreshing pedagogy. So we're going to refresh the curriculum as we've done in Ireland with SPHE and RSE, and basically we're going to queer it. And that's exactly what we've done with our curriculum in Ireland. They're talking about fourth graders beginning to have their own personal dictionaries to keep track of the terminology, cisgender, transgender, the learning goals about understanding the differences between assigned sex and gender identity, talking about the pronouns, the gender binary. And then the students start reading this book about George, a trans kid.
Parents don't have to purchase books anymore. Some of these books don't need to come home in the backpack.
So it sees heteronormativity as an oppressive construct. So they'll advocate to basically everything that is heteronormative is a source of oppression. So queer academics, queer educators, activists, teachers, they'll want to bring in queer identities, queer sexuality, queer politics into every aspect of the curriculum, not just the SPHE. They want to get into this whole school approach, is the term they use. It wants to queer all elements that are described as heteronormative. The male and female gender binary, masculinity, the nature of masculinity and femininity, they have to be queered. The union of man and woman in marriage. Any historical view of the family, does that resonate with what we're voting on in the next few days?
Yeah, removing woman, removing mother, removing home, and adding in durable relationship. It absolutely is all about the referendum taking place on Friday. It's trying to put all of this into our constitution in Ireland.
Yeah. So heteronormative language, I think I've heard that term used by Norma Foley. Established views of normal sexual practices. So in schools today, you'll learn about anal sex, you'll learn about fisting, you'll learn about all sorts of things in the SPHE for the junior cycle, right? The human body, again, queering the body. And trans is basically a mechanism of queering the body. And they basically want to get rid of every structure as well that supports heteronormativity. And this is basically the church, religion, or is a structure that supports heteronormativity, and they would not be in line with that. So there's an academic paper produced by Harper Keenan, who was a trans person, and Little Miss Hot Mess, who's a drag queen. They published this paper just a couple of years ago, and they kind of talk about the whole notion of drag queen story hour and drag pedagogy, which is essentially queer pedagogy. It's just using drag queens as a form. And, they talk about, it's essentially to destabilize children. It's to muddy the notion of their identity, trying to bring the notion of queer identities, destabilize them. And particularly if you do this at a young age, at the very early ages, which is, 4, 5, 6, the ages when children are just coming to terms with being a boy, being a girl, you want to disturb that, because you don't want them to be following the normative path. You want to disturb the normal development of those children so that they now look at perhaps adopting a queer identity, a fluid identity. You can see here, building in part from queer theory and trans studies, queer and trans pedagogies seek to actively destabilize the normative function of schooling through transformative education. Okay, so this is what it's all about. This is not innocent. There's a motivation behind it. Parents need to be aware of that. And again, there's a quote down there: artists have channeled their penchant for playfully reading each other to filth into different forms of literacy, promoting storytelling as integral to queer and trans communities, as well as positioning queer and trans cultural forms as valuable components of early childhood education. So it's there in black and white. People should download the paper. We'll have the link. You can take it down and read it yourself. So queer educators, they would like to see they don't like some of the restrictions that are on them at the moment. So concerns over child safeguarding, they wish to get around any safeguarding concerns. They want them waived. So right now, they're telling children not to tell anything at home in terms of what's going on in the classroom. The whole notion of childhood innocence, to somebody who is queer, this notion of childhood innocence is oppressive to them. It's a threat to them, and they want to get around it. They can't have it. The age level of exposure, as young as possible, starting at age of 3 if possible. Religious ethos, they want to subvert that totally. They can't have any opt-outs or anything like this. They want to get around any sort of moral or religious ethos. And they want to get around any control that parents have. So they want to remove any visibility parents have to the curriculum, and they want to remove any options for opt-outs. They want to mandate, and hence they're doing the whole school holistic approach. So the only way you can opt out is by homeschooling, basically. So queer educators, they see it as their mission to free children from the normative oppression of their parents and help to bring them to a queer consciousness. That's what it's about. So parents, be warned. So queer activists, they all talk about an inclusive society, the removal of outdated societal norms, but the means to achieve this is the indoctrination of children through education. That's it. Inclusion and diversity is the language that they use. They use it with governments, they use it with agencies. It's the Trojan horse to bring queer theory and radical gender theory into the classroom, and also into academia, into other institutions, into corporate offices, etc. It's a philosophical theory. It's a belief system. It's effectively a religion, a Gnostic religion, or a cult. And it should be treated as such. It should not be treated as fact, because right now it's been taught as fact, as if it was science, as if it was reality, as if it was the truth. And that's the problem. And it's been taught to children as such. Like, I've no issue that adults can choose identities and sexual practices, as I say, between consenting adults. That's not a problem. Any libertarian will support that and won't have an issue with that. They mightn't like it or agree with it, but adults are adults and they can do what they will. But what's happening here is they're bringing this into the classroom and attempting to indoctrinate children. Yeah, well, it's been framed under a human rights framework. So this is a kind of inclusivity, diversity framework. So you'll see quotations of United Nations human rights, and we'll get into the United Nations and WHO in another session.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they'll say to you. Well, this is the United Nations. This is a human right. These children need to get educated in this as part of their rights, and we need to have an inclusive classroom. We need to have an inclusive school,
mm-hmm.
an inclusive community. And this notion of redefining human anthropology, as I say here, ignoring science, ignoring medicine, ignoring human evolution, the order of creation. So this thing is basically seeking to take down the current society we have, normalize deviant and perverse sexual practices. Again, if it's adults, that's maybe fine, but don't bring it into the classroom for children. That's the issue. And this relative morality, that there is no objective truth, there is no objective morality. They talk about it being inclusive, but actually it's dangerous to all children, including LGBTQ children. This thing is dangerous to all children. No children should be exposed to this. It destabilizes them, it radicalizes them, ultimately compromises their future, some of them to a huge degree, unfortunately. This is a book I'm recommending to people, The Queering of the American Child, by Logan Lansing and James Lindsay. Logan Lansing is the primary author. I'm just going to use this last paragraph here, which is his definition around queer theory. Queer theory is built on the classical Marxist model of society being split between the dominant oppressor class of those who see themselves as normal and the oppressed class of those who see themselves abnormal or queer. It's incumbent upon the oppressed class to become conscious of the truth of queer theory, to develop a queer consciousness, which is what they're trying to do to children in school, get them to develop this queer consciousness, and to become revolutionaries, charged with taking control of society and deconstructing normalcy. So that's an alternative definition of queer theory. Highly recommend any parent to get this book and read it cover to cover, and probably read it twice. Because if you're not familiar with the subject matter, you'll probably need to read it twice to fully get it. It talks about most of what we've talked about on this, but it also goes into how queer theory is manifest in the classroom, how the lessons in the classroom, bring in queer theory, the mechanisms they use, the Freirean pedagogy as well. And we'll talk about that in another session from Paulo Freire, his mechanisms for social emotional learning, bringing in generative themes into the classroom, getting the children to actually interact and talk and suggest about what we discuss. These are all used to actually bring queer theory into the classroom now. That's what's happening. Some of these things are actually quite good techniques for education, but they're now being used to bring in this, unfortunately. We'll have a lot of references in the description so people can check them out.
It's sort of daunting for parents. Parents can feel helpless. Is there anything, Eugene, that you would suggest that we can do as parents, or that, I know we have a few hundred teachers in our network through the Irish Education Alliance. What can we do?
I think the first thing to do is educate yourself. Educate your immediate people that you know, other parents, other teachers, who perhaps some of them will be bought into this. So some of them will be Marxist, some of them will be queer, some of them will be transing their children and be fully on board with doing that. An awful lot of people are just there. They want to do the right thing. They want to be kind. They don't want to be bigoted. They don't want to be seen as being bigoted. And those people are the people that you need to talk to, and you need to encourage them to educate themselves, and perhaps buy this book as a present. And I know that some gay people who are more enlightened, who are awake, if we want to use the term awake rather than woke, they understand this now. And there's movements in Ireland, there's gay movements in Ireland that are calling out Belong To, because they see what they're doing.
There's Gays Against Groomers. There's loads and loads of people, our gay friends and family members and neighbors that are completely against this as well. So it's just to be clear, don't confuse queer theory with homosexual, two totally different things.